The New Age movement brings with it, as a novelty to confirm its name, spiritual awareness, a concept widely discussed in many industrially developed countries. It is a natural outcome of the hyper-industrialized society in which humanistic values no longer found a proper place amid the relentless pursuit of material prosperity. The natural reaction of the neglected forces of the human personality has caused these renewed forms of spiritualism, Gnosticism or paganism to emerge, develop, and then be consciously implemented. They have redefined themselves as holistic thinking, ecological awareness, feminism, counterculture, spiritual or transpersonal self-development, natural therapy, and more. In addition to redefinitions, old names and practices with an archaic or exotic touch have continued to be used, appealing to the demystifying curiosity of new generations, such as Spiritism, witchcraft, healers, reincarnation, magnetism, and others. To add a note of originality to their activities, groups of business people or specialists use these new concepts or attitudes. This results in effective and seemingly disinterested promotion of the New Age movement, which much of the consumer society is eager to engage with. This has created a large market for books, magazines, films, audio recordings, exhibitions, retreat centers, and more, where a so-called renewing atmosphere is cultivated, contrasting with the profit-driven nature of the society from which it originated. In general, commentators in the heterodox world present the New Age movement primarily as a social phenomenon full of diversity, eclectic, non-hierarchical, fluid, tolerant, and optimistic. In almost all cases, sensationalist journalism has been avoided when it comes to well-documented studies by various specialists, leaving such approaches to the press or mass media channels. These specialists are mainly sociologists, anthropologists, or psychologists, with only a small number of theologians involved, who, more often than not, are simply religious studies specialists, which is telling in itself. Given that Western society has neglected the spiritual development of the individual, theologians tend to become atheistic researchers who, when faced with such a wave of mysticism, want to be impartial, devoid of empathy, and present things scientifically, factually, with moral value judgment being avoided or completely absent. This approach sometimes leads to the total omission of negative aspects of New Age practices, such as deceptive recruitment, coercive persuasion, abuse, and scams. These issues, however, are rightfully exposed in tabloid press or in the much more critical analysis of certain theologians, though their numbers are significantly smaller, mostly within Catholic or Protestant circles. The New Age movement has spread widely, reaching both those already familiar with it and newcomers. While some of its practices are explicit and easily identified, others subtly infiltrate existing ideological, spiritual, or religious movements, integrating like a parasitic plant. Since the 1960s, currents opposing the standards of Western society have emerged, with Western states facing social phenomena such as the hippie movement and rock music. As they reached adulthood, the young people of that era would pursue the realization of those golden age ideals with a certain level of dedication and awareness. The New Age, in part, addressed their spiritual needs, which included discovering new channels for understanding psychic phenomena, following drug use, paranormal phenomena, and most notably, naturalism, the desire to live somewhat closer to nature, free from the stress of sophisticated lifestyle of the West. During that period, countercultural movements emerged, aiming to discover new models, including communist-style utopias, to inject youthful dynamism into a society perceived as lacking vigor and overly focused on material accumulation. Awareness of environmental issues, the search for a new spirituality, and the decentralization of executive power became fashionable topics in the 1960s and 1970s. A relevant example is Mark Satin's work New Age Politics, published in 1979. Some expressions of romantic anarchism even idealized poverty, proposing it as an achievable goal through the self-imposed halt of financial activity. In this context, a significant example from the Euro-Atlantic area is the Friends group in Sweden, which had connections to the anarchist atheist community Comunidad founded in Uruguay in the 1950s. According to its own description, the Friends organization is not atheist. They consider themselves brothers, sisters, and mothers in an extended family that also includes a Jesus, and they recognize only one daddy. They are activists striving for a world where this God is not crucified in churches, a world free from religious compliancy, imperialist economic suffering, and the torture that the cross has historically represented. Such a politico-theological creed reveals a significant departure from fundamental Christian notions, and only with considerable charity can it perhaps be interpreted as a form of condescension toward religiosity. It stands at an immeasurable distance from the Orthodox Matins message, for behold, through the cross, joy has come to all the world. In a political context, one can discern a typical reaction from Western leftist intellectual circles, coupled with a justified solidarity regarding the suffering of the Third World, stemming from colonialism, imperialism, multinational corporations, and the forces that would later be termed globalization. Regarding this, we can mention the international protests against the Seattle Conference in December 1999, which resulted in a temporary setback. The Marxist ideology, as applied and practiced in modern Western mass culture, being by its nature entirely devoid of spiritual light, identifies Western capitalist society with Christianity, the Church, and the Cross, viewing them as instruments of oppression over pre-capitalist societies and as corrupting influences on the idealized pre-Christian nature derived from pagan traditions. The ad hoc solution in this case becomes the decisive abandonment of what is perceived as rotten official Christianity and the adoption of utopian solutions of a communist type or anti-clerical ones inspired by or derived from the atheist Freemasonry of the Grand Orient type. In this context, it seems necessary to take a look at modern society post-World War II in order to deepen and better understand the religious aspect of life for various groups of people in their spiritual and material needs. After an entire generation of sociologists proclaimed that religion had ceased to play its role in society, and that science and reason had taken its place, reality shows the opposite, that there is a natural desire for humanity to move from secularization to religiosity. Shocking examples include the large fundamentalist movements in the United States. A characteristic of the postmodern world is whether or not it is structured religiously. For greater accuracy, it can be stated that New Age is actually a movement with a more postmodern character because it, according to the ideas of sociologist Jean-François Lyotard, sets aside the myth of scientific rationalism and proclaims progress and homogenization at the expense of elites, encouraging the marginalized to the extent that they are likely to become consumers of the product in question. Modernism, characterized by the Enlightenment ideal, rationalism, avant-gardism, and individualism, could be said to be the opposite of New Age, which is filled with myths, magic, and religiosity. New Age is postmodern in the sense that it formally appropriates traditions and myths, giving them a new meaning, which is in fact absolutely necessary to cover the concept of New Age. From this, we can extend and label it as neo-mythology, neo-magic, neo-paganism, neo-occultism, etc. All attempts to revive pre-Christian European pagan cults, such as Wicca and Druidism, fall within this current. In the religious area of the movement, there is at most a diffuse attitude or religiosity. We could say that the excessive atheism of past centuries was the cause of a reaction of resistance and opposition that bore fruit. One can observe here the satanic work carried out over hundreds of years in the Christian world, through which secularism, Fascism, Bolshevism, and even Marxist-Leninist atheism were imposed, even if for a relatively short time, 50 to 70 years in the 20th century. The anticipated and calculated consequence was a general reaction against these forces, but the proposed remedy seems to be the repaganization of society on a global scale. The famous phrase by André Malraux, "The 21st century will be spiritual or it will not be," reappears as a leitmotif in the concerns of the postmodern cultural elite and, like an echo, in the concerns of the masses. Note that Malraux used the word spiritual, not religious, which should be read as mystical. If the 21st century is to become spiritual again, or even religious, the distinction between the sacred and the profane is already re-emerging, with a noble tendency toward the resacralization of the universe. In New Age terminology, this is equivalent to the re-enchantment of the universe or the result of a universal incantation. In a few words, we could speak, using orthodox terms, about the great apostasy, or using the terminology of modern origenists, about apokatastasis, perhaps even about the delusion of the end times. Similar phenomena of religious or cultural fervor have occurred before in history, and it may be both interesting and useful to compare the present with those. Hellenism, for example, was a multicultural socio-historical phenomenon that gave rise, among other things, to religious cosmopolitanism. A representative example of this is the city of Alexandria, where around 1 million inhabitants of different origins lived together in the same community, a remarkably large population for that time. Most of them were naturally Egyptians, but there was also a significant number of Jews, Greeks, and Macedonians, people who were not born there but became Alexandrians at some point in their lives. In this inter-ethnic contact zone, various religious and cultural confusions emerged, whether intentional or not. Differences were often flattened out, and equal signs were drawn between the deities of different peoples, as represented by the inhabitants of Alexandria, in an attempt to reach a kind of consensus, a modus vivendi, or simply a practical commercial understanding. Thus, thought came to be understood as the same as Hermes or Mercury. The actual encounter between Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion, to which other Eastern teachings also contributed, led in that period to the conclusion that there existed a so-called common seed of all things, that God has many names, that man is a divine spark, and other such ideas known from Hellenistic religions, later rejected by the Church. It is interesting that during that time the various adherents of these religious blends were preoccupied with finding ways to recognize one another through a shared language, common interests, or distinctive symbols. All these cultural contacts gave rise to a specific kind of culture, cosmopolitan, we might still call it today, using a term of Greek origin, but also to what we might label as kitsch, a form in which rootlessness and the undiscerning adoption of one or another fashionable attitude inevitably led to a lack of individual distinction and ultimately to a certain superficiality. All these phenomena, ultimately Gnostic in nature, beginning around the years 330-350, became the subject of religious disputes and the crystallization of Christian doctrines in contrast to hetero-Christian, or in other words, heretical conceptions. In practice, the influence of this Mosaic civilization only truly faded during the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, which is the correct form of his title. Constantinople is still referred to today in the formal titles of the Ecumenical Patriarchate as the New Rome. The term Byzantine, as commonly used today, does not accurately reflect the historical reality. As is well known, the Byzantines refer to themselves as Romans, Romaioi, while the Muslims call those lands Rumelia. Furthermore, the label Byzantine carries an anti-ecumenical undertone as it obscures the unity of the Roman Empire and fosters a false West-East opposition. But since in non-Orthodox Europe the temptation is much stronger than in the Orthodox area, and things are not fully understood, All these heresies re-emerged during the Renaissance with great force. The courses on Gnosticism taught by Plato in the 15th century in Florence are well known, based on a Hellenistic manuscript from the 300s in which he presented various Gnostic teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, an Egyptian priest. Renaissance intellectuals tended to value a teaching according to how exotic it was, a trait, unfortunately, that some of our contemporaries can still boast about. It should be noted that the unity of East and West, Greco-Roman, within the Roman Empire, manifested itself both positively and negatively, religiously as well as culturally. The cultural phenomenon of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century was entirely dependent on the work of Greek Byzantine intellectuals who had taken refuge there following the Turkish occupation. This historical fact is generally willfully ignored in order to downplay the merits of those who contributed and to maintain the cliché of the retrograde Slavo-Byzantine orthodoxy, portrayed as hostile to prosperity and integration into the Euro-Atlantic structures. Another period of cosmopolitanism took place in the 1500s, specifically at the end of the Renaissance. During this time, one could observe the interference of various religious practices and cultures of Asian origin alongside Christian ones, elements of astrology, Arabic alchemy, Gnostic speculations, and ritual magic. After a certain period of growth, Hermeticism, for example, declined or was neglected, remaining only in a sort of underground scene with its Kabbalists, Rosicrucians, and others. A similarity to these periods of cosmopolitanism can also be observed in the case of New Age, given a society with vast means of communication and a thirst for mystical spirituality. Just like in the past, the lack of genuine religious life, absence of true spiritual concerns, superficiality, and ignorance have led to the emergence of significant social movements with a religious character. These movements will end lamentably, but not before confusing an entire generation and leaving painful marks, much like during periods of atheism. According to various studies, New Age fits within the framework of such a movement, exhibiting nearly all of its characteristics. Tradition, the petty bourgeois attitude of complacency, and dogmatism all provoke repugnance among the followers of the New Age, which seeks to be dynamic and innovative. In the 1960s, there were a series of anti-cultural movements in the West that made a clear distinction between religion and spiritual life. Religion was burdened with a negative connotation, associated with everything considered dull or uninteresting, while spiritual life became a term that primarily embraced the joy of liberation from moral religious laws, and secondly, a personal breath, a new soulful contribution within a youthful sphere. This attitude corresponds to a defective development of Christianity with a neo-Protestant nuance, which is the root of secularization. Another characteristic of the New Age movement is its constant alignment with fashion. The very fact of being in motion is a hallmark of its trendiness. Its followers are people who keep up with everything newest in the sphere of interest within high society. As with any fashion, the focus of interest is ever-changing. Certain phenomena enter or exit the sphere depending on public demand, in other words, the market. In light of the above, we can say that in New Age, religion becomes a commodity like any other product of consumer society. This phenomenon is of course encountered more strongly in Western societies and less so in countries of orthodox spirituality. By the 1970s in the West, one could already speak of the creation of needs in parallel with the pace at which new products appeared, one of these products being spirit or the sacred. It goes without saying that in this context there are no free or open courses or activities like those in the traditional church. Courses or initiation periods are integrated, scheduled, and catalogued according to well-established plans, with exceptions being, much like free samples in food advertising, just some promotional trials. A true New Age culture is quite costly, leaving those without material means or the free time needed for deliberate dedication to settle for the vague aspect presented in mass media advertising. The undeniable managerial skills possessed by the entrepreneurs promptly meet the demand with a rich offering of courses, seminars, and therapies that are advertised and aim to teach the individual how to live, realize their potential, and feel spiritually well. A typical example in this regard is the free Swedish magazine, The Energy Wave, distributed in New Age boutiques or health food stores, which contains advertisements for various ways to improve your quality of life. From the utopian millenarian vision of the New Age movement flows a new paradisiacal conception of humanity and society. Thus, within the neo-spiritual, feminist, and human potential movements, featuring meditation, therapies, and holistic medicine, there is active advocacy for nonviolence, peace, health, environmental protection, and a solidary lifestyle in which care for one's neighbor and future generations takes precedence. There is also a strong emphasis on cultivating without chemicals and excluding nuclear energy and weapons from our lives. As Orthodox Christians, we are of course in agreement with such God-blessed objectives, beneficial to our fellow human beings and to the cosmos. But when it comes to the motivations, the ultimate goal, and the means employed, our paths diverge radically. For the Orthodox Christian, the natural framework for spiritual growth is found within the Church and never outside it. The Christian lives in the world, but is in essence not of the world. The angle from which the issue is viewed, as well as the Christian value system, differs fundamentally and essentially from that of the New Age, with its neo-Gnostic and neo-pagan currents that are openly opposed to Christianity and the Church. The Christian knows that he is called to be a priest, prophet, and king of creation, of the cosmos, and to be king in this sense means to be a servant, not a slave of it. If, as we have shown, Christians are members of the mystical body of Christ, the Church, then in their own way, New Agers have also sought a form of effective collaboration to achieve their proposed goals. Once again, the efficiency, productivity, and pragmatism of Westerners in worldly matters, which in itself is not condemnable, made their mark through the author Marlin Ferguson, who introduced the notion of a global conspiracy.